Hey everybody, I'm gonna teach you how to make some artisan bread in 5 minutes a day dough. Super easy, shouldn't take you 5 minutes, but it's good practice. So I have my 3 loaves that I'm baking off today ready to go in the oven. We'll cover that in the next class, shaping and putting them in the oven and baking them off. But for right now, I've got my materials ready to go. I've got my trusty box. It's got a little dough left in it, and that's totally fine. Building dough on top of dough is great because you've already got some established yeast growing in there. I've got a bottle of water. It doesn't have to be measured. I just have it in here. Normally I just put the water directly into the container, but figured for you guys I'd show you the steps a little bit more formally. And then I've got my yeast and my salt. So we're ready to make some bread dough. The first thing I'm going to do is just put some water on top of this dough and mix it in so that the existing dough that's in there already is going to get well established throughout the whole mixture. I like to use a spoon that's flat and pretty smooth because the dough is very sticky. All right, I've got the dough kind of spread out in here. So I don't ever measure anything. And really with this recipe, you don't have to. And you actually want to get a sense for what it's supposed to look like, what it's supposed to, the consistency that it's supposed to be, because on humid days, you're gonna require more flour, less liquid. And on dry days, like it is in wintertime, you're gonna want more liquid and less flour. So I've got about a tablespoon of yeast, or just a handful. I'm gonna sprinkle that on top of the water really quick. Make sure it's active dry yeast. You don't need quick rise. Active dry yeast is just fine for this recipe. And I'm just gonna mix that in here. You can see the dough and the liquid. And then I'm going to take the same amount of salt and sprinkle that on the top. Now's the part where it gets interesting, because you just start mixing flour in until it gets really difficult to mix into the dough. So I've got my flour here. I like to use all-purpose, and I like to use unbleached. There's no need to have your bread be extra bleached color. I think that the natural grains look really good in the bread. And lately I've preferred using Sunrise Mill, which is a local mill, pizza flour to make my bread. It's got a really interesting texture, but because I'm making a bunch of loaves, I'm just gonna use the flour that I got at Costco today, and really any kind of flour that's all-purpose and wheat will do. And what I'm trying to do here with my stirring is to make sure that none of the flour is dry or raw in here, that it's all really well mixed in. And as soon as that happens, I'm just gonna add more flour and continue doing that until the mixture is really difficult to add more flour into and have it integrate well. And it should become very difficult to mix. There's no perfect way to do this. Small, medium folding, mixing in one spot at a time, just making sure that that flour disappears into the dough so that you can't recognize that there's any dry flour in here. And scraping it off the sides occasionally. So the reason why I use this particular box is because it fits really well into the refrigerator. I can slide it on one of the lower shelves, and the dough will keep in the fridge for 2 weeks, and I've even aged it longer. But the more days you have the dough in the fridge, the more tangy it gets, and I think the more flavor it develops. And because it's a little cold out today, it's gonna be somewhere close to 40. I'm just gonna keep the dough outside on the patio because my fridge is getting full for Thanksgiving preparations. As long as the dough doesn't stay too warm or too cold, you don't want it to freeze. You certainly don't want the dough to be exposed to anything more than 100 degrees while it's aging, and ideally somewhere around between fridge temperature 40 degrees and maybe 80 would be good. Otherwise, the yeast might activate too quickly if it's warmer and not have that slow, gradual rise, which is what I prefer in terms of the texture of the dough. So it's starting to get more difficult to mix, obviously. The dough is starting to get more solid, but it's still got a sheen to it. There goes the cuckoo clock. So I'm gonna add a little bit more flour. And you can see I'm not really measuring, I'm just paying attention to what's happening with this dough. That's probably the last flour I'll add in, let's see. Just wanna make sure that there's no dry flour in here. But when I talk about difficult to mix, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really having a hard time getting that flour to mix in there, and the dough to get pretty solid to the point that it's giving you a workout. Making sure to scrape the bottoms and the sides just to get all that dry flour out of there and mixed into the dough. This is what the dough looks like now. It's pretty thick, sticks on the spoon, obviously stays as a chunk. The nice thing about these flat spoons is you can just scrape them on the side of your container and they go into the wash pretty clean. So that's how I make my bread dough. I'm gonna put this in the fridge at least overnight, if not for a few days, and then pull off grapefruit-sized pieces of bread to bake off, and we'll cover that in the next class. Hope you have a great day. Thanks for joining me in my kitchen. And I'm Jen with Catalyst